welcome to the Biodiversity Council's webinar on the Global Nature Positive Summit that was held in Sydney last week. So the Biodiversity Council was fortunate to have a number of people from our council that were invited, which we really appreciate is a unique position for us, because I've spoken to people from many other environment groups, science groups, community groups since then, who were interested to know what happened, and many of whom put in ballots to get seats and weren't able to attend. So one of the reasons we're holding this is just to share those insights, and so people can get a better feeling for what happened and what useful things might have come out, possibly some, critique on where we, our honest thoughts on the event, and also where we think the useful opportunities are moving forward. So firstly, I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're all meeting on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands around Australia. I myself am on Turrbal and Yagara country in beautiful Brisbane, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to the elders of the lands from which all of you are meeting us from today. And the Biodiversity Council really expresses our gratitude for the long and enduring custodianship that First Peoples have shown for this whole country and continue to have. So we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers today. First of all, we're going to be hearing from Barry Hunter, who is the CEO of NAILSMA and was also one of the plenary speakers. We'll hear from Professor Sarah Bekessy from RMIT University, who's a specialist in interdisciplinary science, and in particular on biodiversity in the urban environment, and also from Dr. Rachel Morgain from the University of Melbourne, who is a social scientist and the Deputy Director of the Biodiversity Institute. So we'll turn on the chat just at the start, and if you'd like to tell us where you're joining from, to acknowledge which country you're meeting from, that would be really fantastic. During the webinar, if you have any questions, you can put them into the Q&A, and then at the end, after we've heard from each of the speakers, we'll be asking questions of our panel. And so we'll choose questions from the Q&A. Hopefully we'll be able to get through quite a few, and sometimes where we see that people are asking similar questions, we'll try and sort of lump some of those together. So time is short, so I'll go on and I'll introduce Barry so we can get on to the our first talk, because I know that's what you all came here for. So Barry Hunter is the CEO of the North Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance. He's a descendant of the Jugabai speaking people of the Cairns hinterland, and Barry has over 30 years experience in Aboriginal affairs, particularly in the areas of land, natural and cultural resource management, and has worked across government, conservation agencies, the mining and exploration sector, community and not-for-profit NGOs, and recently as a consultant working around Aboriginal land management, the carbon industry and community economic development. And Barry spoke at the summit on a plenary panel session, which was on Indigenous leadership and driving economic growth and sustainability. So thank you very much, Barry.
Thanks for that, Jana. Much appreciated. And yeah, I welcome everyone, but I also want to do a shout out. So yeah, my people are the Jabbergai people on my father's side, and Judabal speaking people on my mother's side, and the hinterlands of the Atherton Tableland, west of Cairns. And I grew up in a little place called Coranda on my father's country. But I'm currently located situated on Larrakia country, up in the Muggy North, in Darwin. Thanks. I want to thanks to the Biodiversity Council, and it was great to catch up with so many other councillors, including yourselves, Jana, and others as well, at the summit. And I do want to cover some key points that I saw, and particularly, focusing not just on those aspects around where I saw Indigenous people mentioned and sitting, and what I saw come out in that regard, but also some of the broader takeaways. I think for me, it was great, and actually had an opportunity to talk with the Minister and thank her for the plenary session that I was on, that included myself and an incredible lady from New Zealand, Mavis, a guy from the Solomon Islands, and Leo Armstrong, who has strong, and Torres Strait Marion Island lady who has strong experience around economic development, Indigenous funding and philanthropic funding. So it was, and facilitated by Joe Morrison, who's a group CEO of Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation. So yeah, being able to thank the Minister for that opportunity to have Indigenous presence straight up front, and that presence was really strong in that regard, not just the panel that I was on, but also the other panels and speakers that they had were really high quality and level Indigenous First Nations people speaking on the relevant topics. And I think that was a strong statement by the Australian government. I really do commend them on taking that position. And that's exactly what the Minister in short words and address to us expressed as well. And I do want to reflect that we see that there was negativity in regards to what would come out of the summit and what it would mean in terms of where we're going and the targets that we know that are in front of us in terms of the global biodiversity framework, but also just what we have in terms of the political situation that sits around the reform to the EPBC Act. That all of those things we know they're uphill battles, and all of us have got differing views on the level of strength of what should come out of the reform of the EPBC Act, and we've expressed those over a long time, whether feedback straight into policy and also direction on that. But I just want to reflect on those things. I think overall for me it was a positive experience, and some of the key takeaways that I've got, again going back to that Indigenous leadership, and those strong statements that Indigenous people need to be engaged within this process. And I can reflect on a number of statistics, but one that's really startling for me is that like we talk about the Indigenous protected areas being now over 60% of the National Reserve System. So obviously there's a need for, and a lot of those Indigenous protected areas, maintain and have some level of high biodiversity values, not just sort of straightforward biodiversity values. There's really some strong values located on those areas. So the arguments alone around that really came out and sort of spoke to the strength. And also just want to do a quick shout out to the partners that we work with in terms of the Kimberley Land Council, Indigenous Desert Alliance, Aboriginal Carbon Foundation, and NAUSMA, who have started the Indigenous Country Biodiversity Alliance, which I'm happy to put in a discussion around the chat. So link to the website if people are interested in that. But quickly, some of the other points that I do want to cover, and for me, being exposed to what market segmentation and those aspects look like, and I had the privilege of attending other meetings with really renowned people who know their stuff around accounting and accounting for nature and processes like that, and listening to their talks, not just at the summit, but having sort of personal conversations, is just blows my mind to see that there's a level of experience and understandings out there, and the potential for where this could go. And we don't know what the market would look like, but we know that there's enough out there to be able to come up with models and to understand, to know that there's potential there, and then like key to that is getting the broader recognition from industry and that commercial aspect, contributing and putting into those processes, and also the responsibility of government where that sits. Like just because we get a market, does that mean government can walk away from their responsibility? So it's those sort of key things that came out for me last week, and that evolving sort of almost sort of day-to-day evolution of the marketplace and what may look like, and when we talk about the nature repair or environmental service marketplace, And I came across a really sort of key term that I'm sort of learning a bit more, and is sort of the sort of transformative potential around that. And, like meaning that it's a different way of looking at things, and we can move into outcomes and marketplace and all those sort of things. But for me, it's always fundamentally, like, what will Indigenous people get out of it? And particularly those people in remote areas where, there's quite often stark choices around management of country, or putting fuel into vehicles to be able to do resource works. So that, that's the practicalities and I guess the grounding that sort of keeps me driving forward in the work that I do. The other things that sort of spoke of, and I just want to touch on that again around, just because there's government concept around nature positive, that what does that mean actually to the average people in the street, or the average person working in natural resource management out in Australia, and where does government responsibility again sit around that? Is it ensuring that the market can work? Is it ensuring that we see funding adequately flow into the global biodiversity framework roadmap that the minister spoke of? And there's a whole lot of other things around that. One thing I do want to cover is again, sort of going back to that negativity, was was a great point that was raised, that will nature positive become another buzzword, and is it now already? We see, and someone made the comparison. I can't remember, an amazing speaker from the US who made the point that there's a potential risk that the words nature positive just become another buzzword like sustainability. What actually does sustainability mean now in terms of measurement and M&E processes to actually know that what we're getting out of it is sustainable, and what measure is that, and how and where is it measured against? So there's all those types of things as well, I think, that are critical to the conversation. The aspects that we see around Indigenous leadership and ranges and Indigenous protected areas now, and that investment that's required in there, it also needs investment of good partners and willing partners who are willing to come in on that cultural basis. And that was one of the points that I made strong at the summit, is that there's that cross-cultural paradigm that we've got to deal with. We still want the same outcome. The same outcome is to be able to look after country, but we want to be able to ensure that we can get on and manage country. Thanks, Yana.
Thanks very much, Barry. That was fantastic. And I must say, I really appreciated many of the sessions, well, the fact that there were so many sessions that had strong Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices in them, and also those First Nations voices from other countries. It was a really powerful aspect of the summit. So next, I'd like to introduce Professor Sarah Bekessy, who leads the ICON Science Research Group at RMIT University, which uses interdisciplinary approaches to solve complex biodiversity conservation problems. So Sarah is particularly interested in understanding the role of human behaviour in conservation, in designing cities to encourage everyday nature experiences, and in defining and measuring nature-positive development. She's an expert in biodiversity-sensitive urban design and spoke in a summit session on biodiversity in the built environment, and presented the Nature Pledge for Urban Developers, which she has been developing in partnership and consultation with people across the development sector, and which will be launching soon. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Yana. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on the country of Wurundjeri people, and pay my deepest respects to elders past and present. And I'm just wondering if that's actually Melbourne in my background. I should really recognise it. I think it probably is.
Yes.
It's definitely grey enough to be Melbourne, but anyway, that's where I am. Thanks so much for the invitation to present. I'd like to really sort of talk about some positives first, some negatives, which maybe some of you have already heard a bit about, and then sort of I'll talk a little bit about my built environment session and what we sort of covered in that session, and then finish with a few take homes. So yeah, positives. I would like to echo both Barry and Jana's perspectives that one of the major positives for me was that as a broad community of nature practitioners, I felt like this was one of the first meetings that we've ever had where there's been truly, primacy given to the importance of Indigenous leadership for nature. And the fact that the very first symposium plenary was on Indigenous leadership to drive economic growth and sustainability was, a testament to that, but it was a really strong theme throughout the whole symposium. Barry spoke extremely eloquently. He was fabulous. But, I think perhaps the real highlight for me were many of the Indigenous speakers that I listened to who spoke eloquently, heartfelt, sort of let's talk, more action needed on nature. And that message came through really loud and clear. I think the second positive was that it was kind of amazing to be in a room with just such diverse people all talking about nature. It was perhaps dominated by industry. I don't think I've ever been to a meeting quite like that before. And, for once it was the CEOs of organisations and not just the, sustainability managers, which I think is a kind of sign of where nature's sitting in terms of the, prominence in thinking. NGOs, governments, First Nations representation was very strong. And then academics, although I have to say, as an academic, there really weren't very many academics at this meeting, and certainly very few who were invited to speak. But yeah, with so many diverse people in the one place, you can just imagine the conversations. They were energizing and exciting. And, I certainly met people who I never would have had the chance to sort of be in conversations with if the event hadn't happened. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. I think the third positive was that I learned a heck of a lot of stuff. There was amazing presentations, a few kind of international. It wasn't particularly global, I have to say, but we heard from a few people from countries who've actually achieved things that we can only dream of in Australia. For example, in one of the plenaries, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, I don't know if anyone else found him impressive. He's a former minister of Costa Rica who spoke about how they've achieved, really quite extraordinary protections for nature in their country and through, political and policy processes. So, I think sometimes I finish my day and think it's just not possible to use policy and political processes to achieve change for nature. But hearing from people like that was really impressive. Another key lesson was all of the information about sustainable finance and how nature kind of fits into this. And, I must admit to you here that I'm probably the person who reaches for the business section first when it comes to lining the guinea pig cage. So, I'm not really kind of that much of a fan about learning about finance, but nevertheless, it's definitely a big thing now. Businesses are scrambling to work out what their nature dependencies, risks and impacts are. In part, they're driven by this task force for nature-related disclosures. And how do they measure? How do they put numbers around this stuff? It's quite tricky, of course. Next year they're going to have to start doing this for carbon. So under the task force for carbon related financial disclosures, and it's everyone. The bets are on that nature is going to be next. So they're all thinking about how they do this. Lots of businesses are trying to understand how they intersect, how even their sector might intersect with nature. Many are kind of evaluating sort of broad pressures on nature, but I would say that very few are actually measuring and reporting, the degree to which their specific business activities are impacting on the condition of nature. In other words, are the plants, animals and ecosystems that they intersect with in better or worse off condition after they've done their business activity? My sense is, if I have to be honest, that many businesses are probably shying away a bit from nature reporting. They're not nature ready. They find maybe nature a little bit too tricky, a bit too uncertain. And it's much harder, let's face it, than carbon to measure and account for. And this is why we wrote a conversation article after the event that was really trying to sort of say, we have to jump into this. Yes, it's tricky, but there are pathways that aren't necessarily overwhelming to measuring and reporting on nature. So let's be in this space and talk to businesses and make sure that they don't back away because of the perceived kind of scariness of nature reporting. So they're the positives. And then the negatives, well, being met by a kind of crowd of protesters outside the summit venue was pretty confronting, and really sort of appreciating the messages that were coming from those protests. Because to be honest, the main negative was that there was no real tangible commitment, new commitments from businesses or from government at this summit. No real leadership, to be honest, other than hosting it and turning up. No new incentives, no new strategies, no new protections for nature, other than, of course, the much heralded announcement of the Heard Island Marine Park expansion, which is, of course, terrific, but has also been met with scepticism, unless it comes tied with funding, extra, really substantial extra protections, and of course, kind of compliance efforts. No acknowledgement of the lack of progress that we've achieved on things like nature laws, or properly funding nature. We already know what it costs to fund proper nature protection in this country. Why aren't we doing it? So quite frankly, I found that underwhelming, and I think I understand the labels of flop and so forth that were put forward by the Greens around this summit. We've got over 2,000 now threatened species listed with threatened with extinction. 19 ecosystems showing clear signs of collapse. We really do need transformative change moving forward. And that certainly wasn't something that we saw a lot of at the summit. But, to be honest, I think everything I see, I'm a bit of a probably nauseating optimist, and I do see everything as an opportunity. And certainly when it came to our built environment session, I was pretty kind of compelled to try and make something of it. Here we were in a room full of, developers, consultants, investors, really well-attended session. What could we possibly do in this setting to really sort of turn things around for biodiversity? I was lucky to be one of the rare academics who were invited to present in this session. It was opened by the New South Wales government architect, Abby Galvin, who was terrific. And she described her own little personal journey of having a house in Sydney with a 1/4-acre block. Lucky Abby. And but concrete, hills hoist, and just lawn. And she turned it into an extraordinary Banksia sort of woodland. And it's now filled with insects and birds. And I think that journey really highlighted to her and her partner in crime in the government architect's office, Barbara Schaefer, that really biodiversity can be part of the urban fabric. They've written this report called Biodiversity in Place that really looks at the fact that we can really sort of have nature in every nook and cranny of the city, from roundabouts to school grounds and sports fields even. So I got to spruik my new initiative for the Biodiversity Council, this Nature Pledge for Developers. And that was really reflecting on the fact that, the development sector is very far from nature positive at present, and is probably responsible for the clearing of some of the last bits of threatened species habitat on the edges of our cities, really important ecosystems like basalt plains, grasslands, Cumberland Plains, woodlands, Swan Coastal Plain. These are all places where we're still clearing quite substantial amounts of threatened species habitat for housing. So, there are alternatives, of course. We know that we can do urban consolidation and actually be regenerative for nature when we're doing consolidation. So this was the pledge. Can developers, investors, consultants, and certifiers sign up to commit to not clearing threatened species habitat and threatened ecological communities going into the future? And so we've had some success. We've had a couple of developers already sign up, and we're really trying to get as many as we can before the COP16, which is next week, where we're going to really launch this pledge wholeheartedly. If you want to check it out, and please give me any advice and feedback on strategy or ideas around it, or sign up to it if you happen to be a developer or an investor. naturepledge.org.au. So just to conclude, it's really great to meet such a diverse group of people interested in nature. Fabulous to see that the need for Indigenous leadership in this space was so well articulated. Very disappointing to see that there were no new commitments, strategies, or money for nature. But, I think coming out of this, we have to recognise that there's a real need to capitalise on this attention to nature, this interest, this motivation, and I think the international pressures that are really are being put onto big businesses. So I think we need to have coordinated asks. Let's actually try and make something of this. I think things like 1% of the budget for nature, easy one that I think we should all be saying to as many people as we can. Let's get 1% of the federal budget. That's measly, but it would be, sort of bucket load better than we're currently doing. Things like having stronger nature laws, having increased investment in Indigenous-led businesses that are nature positive, and in IPAs and ranger programs. My take home would be, let's try and capitalise on this interest and motivation and make something of it, even if it's in the absence of largely in the absence of great government leadership. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. That was fantastic. And actually, I should pass on that many of Sarah's comments echo what other biodiversity councillors have said to me about feeling like the thing that was the most glaring was the lack of government leadership at the event, despite the fact that it was their event. The fact that they were the hosts, but they were often quite absent from the sessions in terms of talking about what they would do, and that many of councillors have expressed that there was a lot of really good intent, including from the minister, but what we're sort of yet to see is that detailed pathway that gives us confidence to how things are going to be delivered, including through how we're going to deliver this in the absence of effective national environmental laws if we don't get the reform of the EPBC Act. So thanks very much, Sarah. That was fantastic. Okay, now we're going to hear from Dr. Rachel Morgain, who's the Deputy Director of the Melbourne Biodiversity Institute. Rachel is a social scientist, and she researches how social structures, cultural values, knowledge systems shape our relationships with the living world. A key focus of her work involves strengthening the resilience of our land and seascapes and communities to climate change and extreme events through restoring biodiversity and natural systems. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks, Yana. And I'd also like to begin by acknowledging country. I'm on the country of the Wurundjeri people as well, of the Kulin Nation in Naarm. And I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present here, and also in the other places where I live and work. And I really want to echo both Barry and Sarah's comments and what Yana just said at the end there. I think one of the great strengths and really fantastic reasons to have been there at the conference last week was the number and diversity of delegates present, and the real willingness of many people there to actively engage with each other. I met many new people across in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander caring for country, across businesses and in other sectors. So it was a great event from that perspective. And just to add to that, I'll also just echo that not only was there an incredibly strong presence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but also a fantastic group of speakers from the plenary sessions and from the floor, speaking, for example, Pacific leaders from Niue, from Palau and many other parts of the Pacific, showing how countries are really acting to protect their oceans and protect their lands while integrating sustainable use in their countries, supporting traditional lifeways across the Pacific and in many other parts of the world. And in addition to that, just a real sense, I think, of how many groups and organisations stand ready to act. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, caring for country groups, of course, also land managers and natural resource managers and many others who are ready and willing to take on the challenge and expand their efforts if resources and opportunities become available. So to me, that leaves really two key issues that were at play or sort of in the room, but not always directly addressed within the summit, which was, the big question of the nature finance gap, and there was a lot of conversation about that, and the more attenuated questions of regulation of environmental regulation and laws that Yana just spoke to. A big focus of my attendance and conversations at the summit was with business, and I'll talk about a couple of the insights of what I understand from the business sector and what I learned about where things are at in terms of business willingness and ability to reduce their impacts on nature, but also to start to close the nature finance gap. So one of the key themes that comes up a lot in thinking about investment into nature, and one of the big themes of what this government has also led around nature, is securing or attracting more private finance into nature. This was a theme at the conference, and there were some great examples. For example, an investment firm, a pension firm from the US, which traditionally has invested in farming and timber, they spoke about how they're looking at now, shifting their investments towards regenerative farming and farming that integrates biodiversity into the way that their investment portfolio invests. Now, at the moment, they're only undertaking pilots in this area, and they're hoping to generate the evidence that will enable them to shift larger amounts of investment. So these are great initiatives to learn about, but what was really clear to me is that we need a significant scaling up of these efforts, and fast, if they're going to make a difference for nature, given that we're facing, ongoing extinctions both in Australia and globally. We know that there's a decline in biodiversity and in threatened species populations. We're facing ecosystems at increasing risk from climate change and global disease vectors and other things. So we need that scaling up. One of the big barriers to scaling up that kind of investment is that groups like investment firms have an obligation to deliver a return on investment to their customers. And this is a reasonable obligation if you think about the fact that, our own pensions or superannuation are invested in, with these firms as well in Australia. For many of us, not being able to have, a pension at the end of our working life would be really a problem. And so it's understandable why these businesses need to deliver a return on investment. One of the challenges is, under law, they're meant to maximise return on investment regardless of the other consequences. So there are kind of legal and regulatory changes that need to be addressed. Perhaps, and what these investment firms are investigating is whether it is better for their long-term return on investment to undertake sustainable practices, which arguably it is. But building the evidence base for that will take time. So we also need flexibility in the ability of investment firms and other businesses to shift their investment. I wanted to pick up this point that Sarah started on, talking about the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. And one of the key messages, particularly from Tony Goldner, who's the Executive Director of this Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures initiative, is that that businesses that are at the forefront are not waiting for this to become an obligation. They're working hard on the TCFD, as Sarah said, the Task Force for Climate-related Financial Disclosures. But many of the businesses at the forefront are not waiting for the extra years that it will take for the TNFD, the Nature-related Initiative, to become law. Rather, they're acting now. And one of the main drivers of that action is a growing recognition that businesses face risks, to their business, including incredible costs sometimes for not acting on their exposure to nature-related risks. And he talked about a report that they've produced called When the Bee Stings, which is looking at case studies from around the world where businesses have paid $1 billion price in some cases for ignoring their exposure to nature-related risks. So one of the examples is the company PG&E in California, they're an electric grid company, and their not so well maintained system sparked wildfires that caused incredible damage across California some years back. And in the end, they have paid a multi-billion-dollar cost compensating for the damage that they caused. I have had a look at the report, and the reality is that most of the environmental risk or nature-related risks that these businesses face are legal or reputational risks still. So at this stage, we're not necessarily understanding or counting the way that risks, that nature loss is actually impacting on business loss, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But one of the things I think that highlights is that our mechanisms like environmental advocacy and like community response and outrage when businesses impact on nature, like legal avenues, and having lawyers actually address environmental costs and risks, is really critical for making sure that businesses pay attention to and have to pay the consequences of where their damage to nature is actually, where they're ignoring nature-related risks is actually causing damage to nature and damage to people. So we need those mechanisms to continue in order for that legal and reputational consequence to really drive changes in business practices. But having said that, I think there is a small but growing number of sectors who are looking at their nature-related risks more holistically and really embedding them not only in short-term risk management processes, but in long-term business transformation. And a couple of examples of that are a little hard to get your head around, but it's starting to be an area where some businesses are exploring. And we heard a great example of, for example, where insurers are working with Landscape Finance Lab and Healthy Land and Water, a land management group in southeast Queensland, to restore mangroves and coastal floodplains and shoring up riverbanks and so on to prevent flooding across or not prevent, but to mitigate the damage from flooding across that southeast Queensland area. And so those mechanisms are really complex because unlike the return on investment of regenerative farming, they don't necessarily immediately generate a return on investment for individual businesses, but rather they lower the risks and costs across a whole sector. So these innovative mechanisms for kind of aggregating those risks and costs and inviting certain sectors to invest are really somewhere that we should be looking to see some change. And I'm looking forward to seeing that happening more and more, but it's complicated and it needs more work. Just a couple of final thoughts. One is that there is a need for public investment to continue. There are many kinds of actions needed to restore biodiversity that neither create a return on investment or address these kind of landscape level risks or other kinds of risks that businesses face. And where they're the case, from the front of the room and from the side conversations I had, it was very clear from business people I spoke to that that they certainly believe that there needs to be continuing public investment for the kinds of actions that deliver public good and environmental good. And so we can't just rely on businesses to scale up these efforts. We need government to be in the room. Another really key message that I heard and that I think is really worth understanding is this came from Valerie Hickey from the World Bank, who spoke about regulation. And what she said was that regulation is the cheapest form of nature positive action, the cheapest form of environmental protection. She also said that businesses want this. Now, she's speaking from a global perspective. And I think what is interesting is that unfortunately in this country, there are some sectors who still are willing to say they don't want environmental regulation, that they see it as an imposition. And I think it's not the right attitude for this country because lots of business actually welcome regulation. It creates certainty and it helps them play on a level playing field. So what we have without regulation is a race to the bottom for businesses that are really not wanting to do the right thing. And so businesses that are really can't compete. Regulation helps businesses who are wanting to take nature positive action to do that and to play on a level playing field with everyone else. And I think that's a message that we really need to understand and hear and talk more about.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Rachel. That was really insightful. We're going to move into some questions. We've had some questions streaming into the Q&A. I encourage you to add more questions into it now. And actually, while people might be doing so, I'm just going to mention one thing that happened at the summit or sort of side of the summit, which I feel like was pretty significant. And it really addresses that question that some people will throw out which is, if government needs to spend more, where is the money coming from? So during the summit, the Biodiversity Council released a report, which is a first pass assessment of subsidies that the Australian government provides that harm the environment or are likely to harm the environment. Clearly, in these cases, it's not their primary purpose, but a secondary impact of those subsidies is harming the environment. And this includes things like tax rebates for fossil fuel use. It's providing large incentives to support the development of infrastructure that's used for fossil fuel projects. It could be subsidising and tax breaks for things like native forestry. So the report that we released found that the Australian government spends $26 billion a year on these subsidies that have a medium to high likelihood of harming the environment. That is about 4% of the federal budget. It's 50 times more money than the Australian government spends on any kind of on-ground conservation actions at the moment. And it is also something that the Australian government is actually legally committed to phasing out through as a signatory to the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. It's Target 18, which it's something the government signed up to 2 years ago, so it's not something that's unknown to them, that they are supposed to identify those subsidies by next year and to start phasing them out. And so potentially we have a huge amount of money there that could be repurposed into adequately funding conservation programs. It's a lot more money than what would be required to lift government spending on the environment, federal government spending up to 1%. So if you haven't seen that report, I'd encourage you to have a look at it. The other report we released during the summit was a report on what is nature positive for businesses and for government. And it's got a lot of really informative basic background about the definitions and what would be involved. And so if you're in those spaces and you're still thinking, what does this mean for us? Definitely have a look at that report. So now we're going to go to some questions. The first question I'm going to throw to Sarah Bekessy is from Gail Dallaston, who I know does a huge amount of work in greening suburbs, particularly getting communities together to do verge transformations to green our suburbs and bring biodiversity onto our streets and get communities out working together. So Gail has asked, greenfield developments are the easiest politically because of the culture that values low density sprawling suburbs. So what can we do to make it easier for governments and developers to do more to restrict development to currently cleared land and shift to higher density suburbs and design for active transport that reduces the land taken up as a result of car dependence?
Yep, great comment, and one that I spend a lot of my time thinking about, of course. And I think one of the first things to respond to here is that there is, Rachel mentioned that regulation is the easiest fix. Well, the reason why developers are clearing threatened species habitat in the urban fringe is because they're zoned for development by the government. So, I feel like step one, let's stop zoning threatened species habitat and critically endangered ecological communities for housing and commercial development. But beyond that, there was a really interesting report that came out from Infrastructure Victoria, who talked about, should we go for sprawl or urban consolidation? And what does it mean purely from an economic perspective? And their report analysed this for, into the 2050 in Victoria, and found that the Victorian government would save $43 billion by 2050 if we focused on consolidation rather than sprawl. So, I think that should be probably enough of a motivation for governments to start looking at avoiding sprawl and moving to consolidation. I think they're just having really good models of how it can work. Unfortunately, massive high rises like you see in our background here, they're not really that lovely to live in, and they're pretty poorly designed. Some of them have got smaller area per apartment than anywhere in the world. So we're living in really tiny, very poorly kind of noise controlled, lack of natural light environments. That's not what we're talking about. I think we've got underutilized models like sustainable mid-rise. We're working with the Nightingale company, who do these kind of really cool, hip sort of, industrial sites. They take them, they put sustainable mid-rise, they have kind of, bicycle sheds and open cinemas and, spaces for people to go and have gin and tonics and the like. And they're really kind of wonderful places for people to live, but they're also extremely good in terms of their use of space. And we're working with them to do regenerative stuff for biodiversity through biodiversity sensitive urban design. So they're the kind of models that I think we need to be looking for.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Sarah. So we've got a really good question that's come in from Richard Edwards, which is really about how do we stop this being considered a partisan issue? And actually, I saw a great little video from one of our councillors, Greta Petzel from the University of Tasmania today, who was also talking about this. How do we stop this becoming a left or a right issue and get to the point where basically all governments see that progress on nature and reducing nature harm is just everybody's business and not a polarised issue?
I might just start with some thoughts, Jana, because I think this is where, the diversity of sectors is really crucial to having that kind of shared voice and shared approach. I mentioned the importance of advocacy and other things, but this shouldn't be seen as an issue for advocates or even for researchers, or others who just work in this space. This is a concern for farmers. This is a concern for tourism businesses. This is a concern for urban developers and other businesses that are exposed to risk. This is a concern for insurers. This is a concern for investors. And so if we can actually work with others, but also really see those others coming together and expressing those concerns, it helps to understand that nature, action to protect nature and to and to restore nature and biodiversity and country is action that will help and benefit everyone. And so, there are lots of other examples of sectors, health, education, many other sectors that benefit from having communities live alongside biodiverse systems and be able to benefit from those. And so we really need to understand, embed that understanding across sectors and have that voice speak across different sectors and different parts of the community, so that no government feels like they should or can treat this as a marginal issue or a political football.
Thanks very much. Barry or Sarah, did you want to add to that? Barry, you look like you're nodding.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Look, I just want to draw on the experience that we see politically with the carbon industry now, and the way that's viewed. There's still questions around methods, and obviously, a lot of them are academic arguments and discussions around the effectiveness. But there's a general acceptance now that we need to reduce, as a nation, we need to reduce our carbon output, but that's accepted now. So how do we get that same sort of value and understanding in terms of nature? And we don't want to see commoditization. That's the ultimate sort of corruption of it. But being able to view that there's value there, and then that those industries and sectors that Rachel spoke about, for them to see and recognise and realise that value. I think that's where the step, and then politically that's what follows. Like the politics will follow last if industry and community sectors step up.
Fantastic. Stay with you, Barry, because I've got a question for you from Terry Walsh, who says, "Love your work, Barry. Was interested in your comment on the need for partnerships that are culturally sensitive and culturally aware. Can you please share a bit more about how the biodiversity sector can do better here?"
Yeah, great. And thanks, Terry, for those words. I think it's about a number of things. One, recognition that there's a cultural paradigm around biodiversity and biodiversity values, country, and the terminology that I use as an Indigenous person, and that's the way I see country, and it's through the eyes of that cultural lens. Those cultural indicators, whether they be keystone species that maybe also picked up in any sort of ecological study as well as keystone species. I think it's accepting that first and foremost is a different way of looking at country. And it's that lens that I say, and those cultural indicators and cultural values, they speak to what I find important about country, and others as well. So that's first and foremost, accepting that. The second bit is that integration of knowledge systems, and I use the term deliberately around traditional knowledge, not traditional ecological knowledge, because traditional knowledge speak to kinship systems as well. Those things are entwined and family related, and it's not just about the ecology knowledge. So acceptance and knowing and understanding and integrating those within the rigor that you get in Western science, and being able to infuse those two is the key to it. And that's the other bit that I really want to strengthen. And there's a number of examples around Australia now. And thirdly, being able to directly invest and work with where you've got ranges and land and sea centres and communities, big environmental NGOs, and there are others out there with the consulting firms or research institutions, and I know many of you are from those types of institutions. Just need to be wary of how you work and approach because for me, it should be about direct investment and directly working with those groups on the ground. And you know, like the support that is there from ENGOs or from the academic sector is that it's support. It's not leading, it's support. So being able to put the empowerment into those groups on the ground and the work that they're doing and go in and support them rather than going in and trying to do with.
Thanks very much, Barry. And I've got a question. It was sort of a comment/question from Dan Rogers, who says there was much discussion around the need for regulation to drive action by businesses on nature. But sort of, I guess the heart of this question is really, what confidence do we have that in the absence of regulation, there is enough of a driver to create markets? I know one of the comments I heard from one of the investment sector speakers was that basically, yeah, we'll invest as long as you can guarantee us a 7% return year on year. And so in the absence of biodiversity offsets being a regulatory mechanism that's driving it, and there was widespread agreement that offsets were harmful, and so basing a whole market based on offsets is a race to the bottom. What's going to drive the price and businesses to invest? Sorry, Sarah.
Everyone knows I'm a bit sort of optimistic. Obviously, the best and cheapest approach is to have regulation so that we just, step one, do no harm. I think that's sort of such a critical part of nature positive that we need to get right, and that really probably only regulation can properly do. But, I'll give you an example of a project that we're currently working on that was not driven at all by regulation. It was a developer doing something in the city who really focused on how this project could bring nature back, create a new park for Melbourne that was chock full of, native Melbourne biodiversity, celebrated culture, worked with, Wurundjeri to really sort of include, stories in the design of the park, etc. Built some towers that were going to be, biodiversity sensitive in the best possible way they can be, and looked at supply chains. And none of that was regulatory driven. That was driven by, one, the fact that they got the tender because they put all this stuff in there. Two, their reputation is slightly problematic elsewhere in the country. Let's just say koalas. Three, they were having mass staff, exodus because their company was being considered to be koala killers. And so, this new approach of being sort of nature positive, yeah, it's greenwashing to some extent, but it's going to deliver some really good things to this site that otherwise wouldn't have been developed. And none of it's driven by regulation. It's all because of market forces at play at the moment. So, and TNFD, it's a company that has to basically ultimately say what are our nature impacts, positive and negative, and this is a really good way to sort of be at least a little bit positive. So I think there are reasons to think that we can have action and activity in this space in without regulation, but it's less efficient and less certain.
I was just going to add some thoughts on that, because I think there's multiple forms of regulation, like requiring large enterprises to report on their nature impacts and dependencies is part of regulation. And if we see those things come online, they will start to drive more change. I also think that there are businesses that are doing their disclosures and their analysis at the moment that will be looking to offset those kind of harder to offset impacts, not in an immediate biodiversity offset regulatory sense, but in a general sense of, we know we're investing in this sector. We know that we have exposure in these ways. We can't completely divest entirely from a sector that is doing mixed things, some of which are not great. And one of the ways that we therefore are going to compensate in the interim until there are bigger transformations across sectors is by investing positively in a market. So I can also see that those mechanisms might happen. I'm not convinced that they will happen on the scale needed to, say, float the nature repair market really effectively. I think it remains to be seen whether that, how effective that market is going to be. But I think it is interesting to see that some businesses are recognising that they will do better in the long term. And I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of them are long-term investment firms, and therefore they need long-term return on investment. So they really understand that sustainability is something that they have to embed in business as usual. we also need changes in kind of cultures of business as well. We need changes in boards and in senior leadership. So that's why I think I really agree with the reflection that there were CEOs, there were business leaders at this forum. And the more those conversations happen in a voluntary way across TNFD, Business for Nature, and these other coalitions, sharing stories of where businesses have ignored the problem and it has really hurt them, and sharing stories of how you can do it well. And sharing positive things like the fact that, there's been this hesitation about nature disclosures, but one of the key messages from the floor that did really hit home with some of the business people I spoke to on the side was that the data are available. You can actually do this work. And so one of the excuses for putting it off is actually not really an excuse. It's more that we need those, we need to refine those measures and tools for putting that into practice, and we just need to start doing it.
Thanks. Now, Barry, I've got one last question that I'm going to throw to all of you for a final comment. But before I get to that, Barry, you've been really involved in carbon markets and potentially in biodiverse, sort of enriched or value-added carbon products. So what do you feel like is the potential? Do we need to have more government regulation step in order to drive these markets, or can it happen without it?
I think initially, certainly we'll need government initiation around this, but I do use that very cautiously, because I remember the horrible days of the emissions reduction fund, and then how that was the low cost abatement scenario in that. So there is a need for it, and the sooner government can step out and let the marketplace do what it needs to do, the better.
Thank you. So we're very close to time. A lot of fantastic questions have come in. So I'm just going to flag that we've recorded this webinar. We are going to send out an email to our subscriber list, and also to anyone who registered for this forum, that includes a link to the recording, and also we'll take some more of the questions that have come in through the Q&A and try and answer some more of those questions. So do look out for that, and then pop through to our website. There'll be a link where you can read some more of the Q&A. So a final question from Steve Murphy and it's really for each of our presenters. Many businesses want to invest in nature, but are not sure how, given that there is uncertainty in regulations and emerging markets. So if each of you just had one piece of advice to businesses now about investing in nature, what would it be? What's your one good takeaway for businesses? Anyone want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. I think that the key thing is that the action that is delivered by investment needs to be the right kind of action, and it needs to be integrated with other kinds of actions. So if businesses are going to invest, then work with the groups who've developed the planning around country and around landscapes that can actually drive that investment. Healthy country plans are out there. Almost, most of our landscapes, and country have healthy country plans. If you work with the traditional owner groups that are the Caring for Country groups, they can tell you where the priorities are for investment, and they can help deliver that priority on the ground. And more broadly in landscapes, there are regional plans and other things that can guide investment. So work with the groups who work with the communities, who know how to do the right work, get those really integrated solutions across landscapes and across country, and really benefit communities, benefit Caring for Country, restore, healthy country and healthy people as well.
Thanks. Barry, what would be your one piece of advice for businesses?
Yeah, and it's probably looking at the other way, in that storytelling sells. Like when we see great stories on the ground, and we want to be a part of those stories, whether around restoration or ensuring, that protection of key values. And I think that's the marketing piece there. That's the selling piece, be able to package those stories up and get them out there. And that's where the value that, everyone wants to be associated with a good story. Yeah,
that's so true. And Sarah?
My point was going to echo that entirely. I think there's a real risk that I'm not sure if anyone's heard of these kind of quite wacky terms, PDF and MSA, this kind of proportion of disappeared fraction of species and mean species abundance. These are the terms that are being used to kind of measure business impact. And I think, taking it back to Barry's point, we need to kind of actually keep it real and actually think about plants, animals, ecosystems, culture. And, if you're investing in those, then, you're a lot better off, and you'll be able to sell your story a lot better than talking about PDFs and MSAs.
Fabulous. Well, thanks very much to our three speakers who've been sharing all of their thoughts from the event and also more broadly. Really appreciate your time today. And thanks to all of the people who've come along to watch and participate and throw in your questions. And if you liked the webinar and it had value for you, and people or colleagues or friends who didn't come, when we send out the recording, do forward it on to them so that we can help raise awareness about these sorts of things. Thanks very much.